You mentioned the original airport in Soldotna.
Yeah.
Now, that wasn't that little grass strip.
No, it was,
Was it behind the hardware store?
yes, actually it was, from Safeway's right to the south, right across there. It's, I forget what it's called now, Warehouse Drive or something, and Wilson's Avenue. There's several streets down that way, but
Perpendicular to the river?
perpendicular to the Sterling Highway.
Oh, okay.
I mean, not perpendicular,
Perpendicular to the river.
perpendicular to the river, yes, yeah, you're right. Well, there you can see it right there.
Okay. And that's a
That's-
street
yeah.
now?
This is,
Yeah.
That's the
okay,
street.
Safeway is sitting right in here, right about there. And the hardware store right now is down here. And this is Binkley Street coming in here.
That'd be about where that roundabout is.
So that's the, which, by the way, that original airstrip was donated by Howard Binkley to the community club. And it was donated with the provision that when it was no longer used as an airstrip, it was to revert back to him. Well, in the meantime, we became a state, and actually the community club deeded it over to the Territorial Division of Aviation, and they did most of the work on it. We did something, the community club did something, but they did most of the work on it. And it was deeded over to the Division of Aviation, Territorial Division of Aviation. Then we became a state, and then when it was abandoned, they wouldn't give it back to Binkley. The state wouldn't give it back to Binkley. Didn't want to. So Burton Carver, at the time, he was mayor. I think he was at the time, I think he was mayor. And he told me that if it's the last thing I do, I'm gonna get Howard his land back. And he eventually did. Howard didn't get his land back, and so he sold off parcels of it. But that was the history of it. But he donated it. And, let's see. That's the Discovery Well in 1957 out on Swanson River.
That's the reason why Alaska finally became a state, that well right there.
I'm sure everybody knows what that is. It's the original bridge built in 1948. And today that bridge still lives in British Columbia.
Is that right?
And it's, of course, it modified a little bit because they had to raise, their regulations required it to be raised, have a higher clearance there. And this goes over the Fraser River north of Watson Lake, BC. And when the first bridge was torn down, it was in the 56, I believe, and replaced with the second bridge. I can't remember the years for sure, but at any rate, it was piled up and hauled over to Crown Point. And there was a rancher who lived and several ranchers were living across the river from British Columbia, from Watson Lake. And they had a ferry that crossed over, and to use that ferry, it was a water-powered ferry. Well, a rancher by the name of Rudy Johnson, his wife got tangled up somehow and flown overboard and almost lost her life. And so he decided we've got to have a bridge. We need a bridge. So he went around and he found that bridge in Crown Point and bought it from the state of Alaska, shipped it down, and he hired an engineer to redesign it and build it. And he did. And then he tried to sell it to the province of BC, and they wouldn't buy it. So he just put a toll on it. He started charging toll. And he did that for several years, and then the BC government decided they would buy it, and they did. So now it belongs to the BC government. But it's still referred to as the Rudy Johnson Bridge. But that is the original Soldotna Bridge. I'm not using my computer that I normally use for this because the output didn't match what they've got now. Now, this is down the road towards Nanilchik. And we had a gravel pit there in 49, I believe. And here he's bringing up a load, and there you can see the shovel that was loading them down there. And I don't remember the milepost, but that road still goes down there, and I forget what the name of it is, but there's a campground there.
Red Bluff?
Pardon?
Red Bluff?
Yes, it is Red Bluff. Yes, it is. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it's Red Bluff, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, this is Seldovia in
That's before the earthquake.
1955. I had a charter air service out of Soldana at the time, and one of the cannery people, one of the superintendents, needed a charter to go to Seldovia. And I'd never been to Seldovia. And of course I had a map. And so sure, we'll go. So we went down and I found Seldovia. And he was there for an hour or two doing business, and then I took him back. And but at that time thank you. At that time all the boardwalk along here was built up with hotels, bars, canneries, everything built out over, not everything, but a lot of things built out over the water. And I do have a before and after picture. Okay, this is the 55, picture in 55. You see all of these buildings along here, along the waterfront? Well, in 64, the earthquake came along and all that land settled. Well, when it had high tide, the hotels, the bars, the restaurants, the canneries were all flooded. And so they had to do an urban renewal to the extreme. And all of those were torn out. And then, I'm sorry that I have to take so much time looking for this, but now that's what it looked like 50 years later. It's all beach there. Nothing built out over the water anymore.
So Al, when they did that urban renewal, was that when they put water and sewer into Seldovia, or did they already have water and sewer in Seldovia? That always really impresses me.
I really don't know. I've only been to Seldovia half a dozen times in my life, and the first time was 55, and I really don't know. I think they did. I kind of think they had water and sewer. I think, but I'm not really sure. I walking around and looking underneath those, under the pilings there, I'm not so sure they did have sewer. It looked like it was going into the.
Every day. A lot of people had septic tanks. A lot of people just built their outhouses at the end of their piers.
That's kind of what it looked like to me.
And so the tide coming and going was their sewer system until the Corps of Engineers came in after the earthquake.
That's the Kenai Commercial Company, and that was, I would say this is probably 1949, and Helen and Cecil Jones were running it, and they owned it along with a partner, Wells Irwin, who was their partner in it, and the door on the left was the grocery store, the door on the right was the liquor store. The building is still there. It's been modified considerably, and it was law offices, I believe. So, I think that's what it is now. I haven't been there for for 3 or 4 years anyway. And this is what the Cooper Landing Bridge looked like about 4 days after the earthquake. And after about a week, I forget how long, I was about a week and 3 or 4 days afterwards, I drove to Seward, and they had the Bailey Bridge in, so you could drive across the Bailey Bridge. And this bridge was replaced later on that year. I can't remember, but it seems to me between here and Anchorage, there were something like 27 bridges out. Anybody know any different than that? Somewhere in that neighborhood.
So they got that replacement one in 10 days?
Did what?
They built that replacement bridge, that Bailey Bridge, in 10 days?
Yes, yes. They flew it with the C-124 into the Soldotna Airport, and I believe DOT put it in, I'm not sure. I was busy on the radio all those days, first 3 or 4 days, I know what was going on, but yeah, that was built, I would say within 10 days, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Those are those modular units, aren't they, Al, that the
Yeah, they
Army uses?
Yeah.
Because
They're all
they're
kind of
ready, they just
prefab,
put them
and-
together,
They had to do that along the whole road.
yeah.
This is working on the Sterling Highway down around Clam Gulch.
That's what I was gonna ask.
And it was kind of muddy, and a lot of those trucks had to be pulled. And so it was, yeah, there were times it was pretty muddy, but that's part of the construction down south. Oh, that's just another picture of Soldotna. We've seen a lot of those, so. Okay, this is, I don't know the date of this, but this is the current Soldotna Airport, and it was started in 1960. I don't remember when the first plane landed on it, but the first plane to land on it was Melvin Tatchik. And this is Ray Sandstrom and the grader. And this is when we built the North Road. Starting out, we started that in 1949 from Kenai North, and it was started late in the year. We got out somewhere about Samata Lake, or Lower Samata Lake, I think. I'm not too sure, but I know it was quite a job because it was extremely cold, and we worked late that year, and I had a mechanic working on the night shift to keep all the equipment running, because if you shut it down at quitting time, you wouldn't start in the morning. So he kept the equipment running all night long. And but we worked up until, golly, it was almost Christmas, I think, before we quit. And normally they would quit road construction long before that. Okay, this is a picture of Kenai in 1950. Now, my brother Glenn took that picture. I didn't take it. But this is the CAA things down here. That's where the current senior center is. And this is the town. And you can see two things, the new school, and here's Kenai Joe's bar. He had a shiny roof, and you can recognize that. So that's two things you have there.
I'm going to say that my husband took the census in 1950, and Kenai was 250 people, and Soldotna didn't appear because we didn't have 25 people.
Oh, is that right? Well, you know, I lived in Kenai till 1950 when I moved to Soldotna, and the first couple of years I lived in Soldotna, and if I'd go to Anchorage, and somebody say, "Where are you from?" I'd say Kenai, because if I said Soldotna, they'd, "Where's that?" So I might as well say Kenai. They knew where Kenai was. Which incidentally, when the highway was dedicated in 1950, Bob Atwood, of course, was here, as I told you, and the next day the articles were in the paper, and it said that, I can't remember now, I have copies of them, but it was they gathered on the river outside of Kenai. I think was the expression they used. I can't remember the exact word, but Soldotna wasn't even mentioned because nobody knew where it was. And anyway, yeah, they gathered by the river. Just a lot of this, whatever, but outside of Kenai. Do we have to shut down now? It's 2:00.
Yeah, it seems like, no.
Pardon?
I mean, You don't have to stop, but maybe
Well,
you're getting
I don't wanna bore these people.
I know you've been here a couple hours, Al.
Uh,
I had a question, Al, about those firefighters.
Yeah.
So that was a crew to fight a whole forest fire, just two guys and a pump?
Oh, it depends on the size of the fire, of course.
Wow.
Yeah. This was a small fire, and we flew over it, and I can't remember the details, whether they were with me or whether, we had a fire station in Fort Yukon, so this was close by, and I don't recall, I kind of think one of the pilots in Fort Yukon told me about it, and so I just grabbed the two firefighters that were there, and we went out and looked over it and saw it and landed on the sandbar, and they walked across the river.
And then they successfully put it out,
Yeah, they
just
did.
two
Yeah,
guys.
they had a water pump with them.
Oh, yeah.
And so that helps, of course.
Wow.
But if it just had a Pulaski and an axe and a shovel, that's another story. And, but anyway, they had a water pump and, but, you know, we put 50 or more people on a fire, depending on entirely on the size of the fire. And that was always the biggest problem. See, we didn't have smoke jumpers in. They got them a year or two later, they got smoke jumpers, but at the time, we had to find a landing place on water or land close enough that they didn't have, and helicopters were not really used that much. They were extremely expensive. And so anyway, we just, the best way we could. But that was one of the first things on a fire. It was not just where was the fire, what was the size of it, how was it burning, but where could we land the crew?
Mm-hmm.
And when we got the Grumman gooses, that made a lot of difference because you could put 7 or 8 people in a goose and land in water or land.
Oh.
And so it made a world of difference, yeah. This picture here is a picture of Kenai in 1952 on a cold day. That's the Kenai runway. But
Oh, yeah.
anyway, we better shut it down, I guess.
Anybody else have any questions?
Yeah.
My mom wanted to see the picture of Kenai Packers that was right
Of
next
Kenai
to
what?
this. Kenai Packers, it was right next to this one.
Oh, sure, you bet. Yeah.
I worked there.
We got a, oh, come on, I hit the wrong
Where?
thing there.
Kenai Packers.
I'm using a computer that I don't normally use for this. My old one is too old fashioned for the equipment here.
No, we changed
Anyway.
the stuff on Al since he was
Pardon?
here last. We changed the wires since
It's
you were
it's
here
working,
last.
yeah, it's working anyway, yeah.
You're extremely
Okay.
flexible.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm trying to think of which one this was. I think it was this one. Is that the one?
Yes, the second row, or second row, 1, 2,
This
3,
row?
4, fifth one over.
She's one of the Irish.
No, not there.
Right there,
She still comes in every Wednesday to
up and over. one.
16.
Oh,
There you go.
Up one.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there you
that's it. Yeah. Yeah, that has to be not a very good picture. Yeah, that's Kenai Packers in, 53 or 4, something like that. That's Harry White's Waco airplane sitting there. But yeah, that was Dobby's Cannery, yeah. I have an aerial picture of it later on in '83, but this was in the 50s. It was in the 50s sometime.
She's nodding her head.
Pardon?
My mom's nodding her head.
She's familiar with Dobby's Cannery, I know.
Thank you.
Now, Harold Dobbinspec owned the cannery, and everybody called him Dobby. Yeah. Anyway, any more questions?
I had a question.
Sure.
I remember when Wilson's store and pens and everything was there and everything. Right now, the brothers that have they sell shrimp and different things.
Johnson
The
Brothers?
Johnson Brothers, in front of what was Vera's Variety,
Mhm.
but before that, it was the Wilson store.
Yes.
And then Wilson's built the other store
Yes.
over here. And then, where was the propane tank business that was nearby?
Right next to it, north of it.
And then they had a leak, and propane, because it's heavy, it
Yes.
went along the ground
Yeah.
over to Wilson's store and
Yeah.
then blew up.
Well, what happened is they had a large tank there, and the small truck was going around filling people's tanks. And he stopped and he hooked his hose up and filled his tank and drove off, forgetting to unhook the
Oh,
hose
that's
and
how
hook
it-
the connection.
I always
I was
wondered.
standing in my shop, which was about 500 feet from there, and I had my back, by the door, I had a glass windows in it, I had my back turned and this tremendous explosion, and I turned around and looked, and I saw a car hood flying across the road. I saw some other debris flying across the road, and I knew immediately that nobody survived this. They couldn't have. It turned out they did.
Yep.
But
Mrs.
then I
Wilson.
walked down right away. I walked down, and Don was in the store, and Verona and Vera had been burned because they were walking down where this propane was laying there when it exploded and burned their legs.
Yeah,
And they
that's
had to be
on there.
medevac to Anchorage.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I remember that.
Yeah.
Huh,
Oh,
never heard that story.
That was
Oh,
a
yeah,
terrific
yes.
explosion, yeah.
Yeah, I met Mrs.
Clark Fair
Wilson.
wrote a pretty good story about it in the Readout Reporter, and it's still online. The Readout
Oh,
Reporter's
okay.
online, and it's searchable, so you can find it on there if you want to read the article. But,
You are so high-tech, Al.
pardon?
You're so high-tech, telling us that the Readout Reporter's online. We can search
Yeah,
it.
that's true,
Well,
really,
anyway.
at this stage, yeah. Got a good mind.
Well, I sure appreciate you coming down here and sharing all this.
So much history.
And my calendars were
Off the bluff from Kenai Commercial Company. Yes,
You know, you mentioned some of these places like McGrath and, you wouldn't happen to have any early pictures of Grayling or Ambic or, I'm just kind of thinking of all the places I've been to. You mentioned McGrath.
I've been to many places in Alaska, but Grayling and Anvik I haven't.
How about Nome? You got any?
You know, I
We
never
spent
got
3
to
years out in
Nome. I
Nome,
was
too.
headed for Nome one day, and the weather was so bad, I got within about 30 miles of Nome, and it was so bad I turned around and went back to McGrath. I've never been to Nome. I've been to Kotzebue, Unalakleet, and Chalkitsik, and you name it, but Nome and,
Kotzebue's weather is the same kind of thing, but we don't guarantee anything there.
yeah. It was one of the interesting things about Kotzebue. We had a fire over Selawik. I think it was Selawik, and I was running low on gas, so I had to go to Kotzebue to gas up. And I've been gassing up in Fairbanks every day, and I forget the price of gas. But anyway, I expected, and of course, it was government paid for it, but I expected to be rather high priced. I bought a barrel of gas there for considerably less than what I was paying for it in Fairbanks. And I took out and filled both of my tanks and left the rest there for somebody else. Yes,
So when we lived in Nome, when the barge came with the fuel,
yes.
the price of fuel was that price for the whole winter? Because of course, the ocean froze
yeah.
and they didn't get any more in
Yeah.
all year.
Yeah.
So, all winter, I mean,
So
so
it-
that was the way they figured it in Nome when we lived there.
Unalakleet was undoubtedly the same.
So I would imagine.
Standard Oil had a big place there where they had got fuel in there. I know I bought it from Standard Oil. And,
So whatever the price was when it was delivered, that's what it stayed.
yeah, yeah.
That makes sense.
I wonder if they still do that today. I rather doubt it.
They did it 10 years, last time we were there, we left in 2007, and that's what they were
Yeah.
doing, so I don't know. But they don't get, once it freezes, the barges don't come
Yeah,
anymore, so.
yeah, true.
Yeah.
Of course, it's not freezing
It's
that
not
much
freezing, it's
anymore.
freezing later and later every year,
Yeah.
Boy, I just thought of something. You covered some ground. Did you ever get up to Chandelar or?
Yes.
Or
Bettles.
Bettles?
Yes.
Yeah? What was there like
Our
Bettles?
village,
There was
Chandelar,
old
Champions
Bettles
League.
in those days.
Pardon?
If I remember, it was like old Bettles. Didn't you have to land upriver a little bit?
On Bettles?
Yeah.
On Bettles, they had a fairly new airstrip there, and the CAA had a flight service station on the, you know,
Yeah, well,
I have a picture of it somewhere from the air I took. I don't know where it is, but yeah. Yeah, I don't know what's there now, I have no idea.
Well, I trapped, this is early '73, I was over in Channelar, and then I snowshoed over to Bettles, and you talk about.
That's a good little distance.
Oh, yeah, I was starved going over there, but they, I didn't figure my food right. Was, the old Bettles town was like downriver, and then maybe when FAA moved in, they moved the whole town. It's like everybody was sitting here
Yeah.
eating and everything, got off the building and then headed upriver a couple of miles. And
Yeah.
old Bettles was like preserved.
Oh, really?
But then after I left, I had heard that vandals were coming in and.
The main thing I remember about Bettles is the area around here, the vast amount of nothingness. You look for miles and miles and miles and see nothing. Okay, my clock just about says 12:59, so we're gonna hold this up and get ready to go.
That was a little pre-program.
Al,
We
Yeah.
didn't miss
Those
it.
two buildings that you just showed,
Okay.
that was up on the screen that you, with the drying fish?
Yeah,
Okay, was that right on the Kenai Bluff there?
yes, down on the flats, off the bluff. Yeah, down
Which
on the
is
flats.
gone.
Now, if you stood in front of the Showalter's house or the Kenai Commercial Company and looked down, they were right there in front of you.
So all of that, that's gone now?
I know it is, yeah, it is, yeah,
Wow,
yeah.
okay. So they didn't recognize it?
Yes. Okay. Okay, it's 1 o'clock now, so we'll start, and I turn this on.
It's on. It's on.
It's on? Okay, good.
I can turn it up.
I'm sorry. Anyway, I hope I won't be too boring today, but at any rate, as we go along here and show you these pictures and talk about different things, you're welcome to ask questions, and if I don't happen to see your hand come up, just yell at me. I'm hard of hearing, but I got my hearing aids in, so I can detect you, I think. But at any rate, getting ready to start, and what I decided to do was, for the first few minutes, talk a little bit about the history of Soldotna Creek Park. And in 1946, I believe it was 46, Congress appropriated $3 million to build a road from in Cooper Landing, and where Hinton's Lodge was, at the edge of the Chugach National Forest, to Homer. And so they set up a camp in Homer, they set up a camp in Kenai, and this is the camp they set up in Kenai. It was intended to be a temporary camp, and all the buildings were KD, they were knocked down buildings that were war surplus, and so they were temporary buildings, and it was intended to use it for a few years and then build a new camp, a permanent camp. And in 46, Ralph Solberg and Gil Giglione, Ralph was the general foreman for the northern end of the project, but Claude Rogers was the general foreman in Homer. And anyway, Gil and Ralph Solberg set out looking for a bridge site to put the bridge in Soldotna. And they got a little, went up and down the river, and they found a good site for the bridge, and then they decided to look for a camp, for a permanent site for the camp. And so they went to Soldotna Creek and found that one, and of course, you have to remember that nobody was living there at the time. There were, I don't think there were any homesteads filed in that general area. Were there, Marge?
Homesteading didn't open until 1948.
Yeah, that's what yeah. So anyway, in 1946, they picked that site. Now, a lot of people have criticized it later. They picked the nicest site for a camp, and this should be a park. But you got to remember, these people were going to be living there on the camp with their families. And when you go out looking for a campsite and all this wilderness is there, you can pick out whatever you want. You're not going to pick out some swamp somewhere. You're going to pick a nice place. And there was nothing political about it. It was just a simple fact that we're looking for a home, and this is a nice place to have a home. And so they picked it, and they kept it for a number of years. But anyway, I'll back up a little bit. In 1950, September 5th of 1950, they dedicated the Sterling Highway at the bridge in Soldotna. And there were 2 DC-3s came in from Anchorage, carrying dignitaries from Anchorage. And we went at the road commission, we rounded up all of the vehicles we had, the private vehicles and everything else, to haul these people around. And I had a new 1950 Studebaker, and my buddy Hedley Parsons, he also had a 1950 Studebaker. So I had the lead car and he had the second car. And we picked them up and we went out to the road commission and we had lunch. And now here they are. And this one that's the mayor of Anchorage, Z.J. Lusack. The cigarette is all you can see, but that's Bob Atwood. General Cunningham was the head of the U.S. Army Alaska, the commanding general of U.S. Army Alaska. And next to him, we have Governor Greening, Ernest Greening, who was the governor at the time. And next to him is General Kepner. General Kepner was Air Force general, and he was in charge, they had commanding general of the Alaska Command. The Alaska Command was over all military in Alaska. So he was the highest ranking military officer in Alaska. And anyway, we had lunch there. Oh, that's the Carmel Snyder, the cook's wife. She was a waitress that day. We had lunch, and then we drove out to Sterling. And Paul Nestor was our grader operator, and he had been grading the road every day for a week. And it was great. It never was that good afterwards till they paved it. But anyway, we drove out to Sterling, and I had Governor Greening was sitting in the front seat, and in the back was Colonel Noyes, who was the head of the Alaska Road Commission, and Bob Atwood and General Kepner were in the back seat. And as we approached Moose River, we didn't cross the bridge. That was the old narrow one-way bridge. And we stopped at the top, but when we got up there, there was an airplane sitting alongside the road and a sign there that said Moose River Air Service. And that was Walt Peterson's airplane. Well, I knew he had an air service there, and there was no airship. He operated off the road. But I happened to think that not long previously, the territorial legislature had passed a law making it illegal to land an airplane on the road in Alaska unless it was an emergency. And the governor signed the bill, so it was enacted. And the governor looked at me and he says, "Does that man operate off of the road?" And reluctantly I said, "Yes, he does." The governor's response was, "My, how enterprising." So, anyway, that was good. And then we had the dedication. That's General Kepner speaking. The white-haired gentleman is Archie McLean from Kasilov. Next to him is Mayor Lusack, and then the big head of hair sticking up is Hal Thornton of Kenai, and the hat there belongs to Governor Greening. We had Mr. Anzaleski from the Nilchik spoke. I can't recall who spoke from Homer or Seward, but somebody was also a spokesman for Homer and Seward. So we had well represented there. And after the dedication, well, this is more of the dedication. This is a picture here that I did not take. This was taken by Steve McCutcheon. I bought these pictures from him. But this is the back side of it. And if you'll notice all those people lined up there, and when I talked about in the past about the dedication and all the people there, somebody said, well, there weren't that many people here in 1950. I said, no, but the road commission put out some tables with free food on it, and the homesteaders came out of the woods. So there you see them. And anyway, this is another view of it, looking at the bridge from the back side of all these people. Then the governor cut the ribbon up in small pieces and passed it out to anybody who wanted it. And I've often wondered who that little girl is and who that man standing there with the hat, but I've shown these pictures a number of times and nobody's ever come up with an answer. So anyway, well then, after that dedication, we drove down so that all these dignitaries could see the new site where the road commission would be building their permanent camp. And as we drove in there was a tent sitting there, a rather large tent, and Joe and Mickey Fay and their kids were living in that tent. And Colonel Noyes from the back seat said, "These people are trespassing. They have been asked to leave, but they're still here." The governor turned around and says, "John, they're not hurting anything. Leave them be." So anyway, but the interesting part of it was Mickey Fay, a few years later, got on a campaign to try to get that land taken away basically from the road commission and given to the Bureau of Land Management Division of Forestry to maintain a park, a roadside park. She was on that campaign for quite a while. She was not successful at the time, but she had an in because at that time I was flying for the Bureau of Land Management, the Division of Forestry, and Roger Robinson was the head chief forester for Division of Forestry, and he had his office in the federal building, and his secretary was Mickey's niece. So she was able to get access to Bob Robinson and try to get him to do it. So I happened to stop by the office one time, flying back from McGrath, and I had some business there. So I went in, and his secretary said that Mr. Robinson wanted to see me. So I went in, and he asked me a few questions about the site and what people thought about it and everything. And I answered his questions, and he said, if they do take that away from the road commission and give it to us, we will maintain it as a roadside park. But we will not get involved in the squabble between the road commission and anybody else. And so they went ahead and they built it. And this was what it looked like in about 1953. And we have, I don't know if you can see me, there's Soldotna Creek coming into there. And this was the Mullins Airstrip. Marge and Frank Mullins had a little airstrip in there. I used to land on it occasionally, but it was a little bit short and tall trees on both ends. And it kept knocking down the tops of trees, so I quit doing that. But anyway, that is now Lincolnberry Lane. And so it was a good deal that they had an airstrip, now Lincolnberry Lane. This is another view from the other angle, looking from the south to Soldotna Creek. There you can still see Lincolnberry Lane there. This was Paul Nestor's place here. My house was right here, and Chell Bear's house was here, and the Farnsworth house was there. This is a 1961 picture. They built this they started building in 1956 to build their permanent camp there. And 1955 they started. And by 1956 they had moved in. And they stayed there. Now, they were, of course, the Alaska Road Commission, I'll give you a little history of that. It started in 1905, and it was originally an agency of the War Department. So it always had a military man in charge, usually a colonel. In fact, when I was in 1950, Colonel Noyes, he was not active in the Army at the time, but we still called him Colonel Noyes, because and Colonel Noyes, by the way, I'll get sidetracked here, but he later was promoted to Brigadier General and was a head of the Alaska National Guard. And in 1956, he was in a Guard airplane headed to Nome, and they crashed short of the runway, I don't know how far, late at night in January. And they set out search parties immediately, but they never found it till morning. And when they found it, unfortunately, Colonel Noyes had survived the crash but died of exposure. So, but getting back to the history of the Road Commission, it always was a military-run organization. They didn't have military working for them or civilians working, but it was headed by they called that the president of the Road Commission at the time, and it was always a colonel. The first one was Colonel Richardson, Wild Preston Richardson. He later became a general, but the Richardson Highway is named after him. Then we had General Steese, who was another one, the Steese Highway named after him. But anyway, it remained an agency of the War Department until about 1932. It was transferred over to the Interior Department. And it was that until 1956, it was merged into the Bureau of Public Roads, which was a federal agency of the Commerce Department. And then after statehood, of course, it became state and DOT. But anyway, this is a picture of it in 1956. And here's a 1961 picture of what Soldotna looked like at the time. And not a terribly good picture, but it shows you what the area looked like at the time. And of course, DOT is still there. And I think this is a 1975 picture. Now, somebody's going to ask me, when did they move out of there? And I don't have the answer to that, because at my age, I can remember what happened 75 years ago, but I can't remember what I had for breakfast. John, you probably know when they moved out of here.
I don't remember myself the dates,
Okay.
sorry.
Well, eventually they moved out, and it is now Soldotna Creek Park. So,
I think it's about 2005 or
I
so.
was gonna say, it wasn't that
Yeah,
long
it's about
ago.
2005, I believe.
About 2005?
Yeah, somewhere in there.
Yeah. Like I say, I couldn't remember when it was. Now, this is a picture of 2007. And you see what we've got there? It's not a very good picture of the park, but there it's in use now. You can see the Peninsula Center Mall here. And anyway, this is another shot of the Y. And it's probably around 2005 or 6 or something. Wait a minute. Yeah, 2006 or 7, something like that, yeah. And this is a fairly good picture of the Y and the park down here, and we have Fred Myers up there. And this is a 2007, I believe. I should remember all these, but I don't. Now, that's a fairly good picture of the park as it's used today. And by the way, I believe Mickey Fay passed away before they actually got the park going. So whenever you use the park, think of Mickey Parker. I'm not Mickey Parker, I'm sorry, Mickey Fay. She was the one that really started the ball rolling to try to make that a park. And she didn't succeed. Got a few pictures of some people here. This is Howard Binkley standing by his cabin. And Howard was a homesteader, and he was also kind of the first real estate guy in Soldotna. He started selling land. In fact, I bought my land from him, and a lot of people did. But and I think I saw, yeah, Barb Jewell is here. This is Ray Sandstrom's picture, Barb's father. He took a lot of these pictures, and this was one of his pictures. But anyway, people asked me where was his cabin located, and this is where it was. If you can see that red circle there, down close to the bridge, that's where his cabin was. His homestead covered, yes?
I want to say that's his second cabin.
The what?
That's Howard Binkley's second cabin. His first cabin.
Oh, yes, it's true. That's true. Yeah, he called it the shack. Yeah, yeah. I have a letter that he wrote telling about his cabins, and so that is his second cabin. Yes, you're right. Yeah. Eventually, that land in there he sold to Art Frisbee, and he wound up selling it to Ray Bilodeau, and I'm not really sure who owns it. Yeah, I know who owns it now. Gary Hinkle? I think, I'm not sure. But anyway, that land down there was originally Binkley's, yeah. Okay. These are two of our pioneer, they were not homesteaders, but they built the first grocery store in Alaska, Don and Verona Wilson. And they had this little building that they built, and they lived in the back half of it. By the way, the building is still there. The Johnson brothers sell fish out of it, and it's changed a lot, but it's still there. And in somewhere in the early 60s, they built a new store, and it was, of course, more modern. It had refrigeration, and it was a nice building, and a basement in it, and a conveyor to bring things up from the basement, and very modern, nice store. And eventually that was torn down, but the old building is still there. So anyway, and this is Verona's brother, Lawrence Keeler. We called him Pappy Keeler. And he and his son Jack homesteaded out of town a little ways, where Good Time Charlie's is now. Behind that, that was their homestead. And they homesteaded there and lived there until, I presume, somewhere in the 50s they moved out. And here we have 4 characters from Soldotna: Doug Rieger, Tommy Fay, Billy Bear, and Paul Rieger. Now, I talked about Joe and Mickey Fay, but in all the pictures I have, this is the only picture I have of Joe and Mickey. And it was a masquerade party at the Bear Den, probably about 1954. And I'm just going through all my pictures, and that's one thing that Ray Sansom was good at taking pictures of all the old timers. I took other pictures for some reason or other. So I don't have a lot of pictures of the old timers, but that's my only picture of Joe and Mickey. This is another character. That's me and my moose, Maggie. And I was giving her a piece of bread. This was in 1954. 1964, I took this picture. This was a start of a sled dog race, and we had the state championship sled dog races here every year. They would run from one day, it was a 2-day race. One day they'd race from Soldotna to Kenai, and the next day they would come back. And they didn't just go along the road, although quite a bit of it was along the road, and then they would go back out, and I do not know how long the trail was.
22 and a half miles.
Pardon?
22 and a half miles.
22 and a half miles. Thank you, Carol. And, but they eventually had to quit it because there were so many people building up along the trail that it was inconvenient and kind of hard to get permission to go through there. So they changed it and they rented it from the current airport. This is the old airport here, by the way. The current airport out into the woods, out in the wildlife refuge. But anyway, this is 1964, and the only people I recognize in this picture was these 2 people over here is Bill and Charlotte Ishii. And anyway, but I don't know who the dog mushers are in here, I don't recall, but it's right behind where Trustworthy's Hardware is, and this was the starting chute. They'd start there and they would end up there when they came back the next day, the old airstrip. This is 1974, and that's Doc Lombard. And I was part of the amateur radio club, and we covered the races for a number of years. And when they changed it, this was running out into the woods, of course, out from the airport. And when they changed it, some of the guys went out with their radios and with snow machines, and I went down by the school south of town and skied back in a couple of miles and set up my radio antenna and reported my station. And I took this picture of Doc Lombard going through it. Doc Lombard was from Wayland, Massachusetts, and he was a fixture at all of our races in the early days. And he passed away a number of years ago. And what we did is we made up this board, and we put the trail on there, and then we had numbers on Velcro strips, and then when we would report in that such and such a racer went by, his number was posted on that post, and that's how they kept track of where the racers were. And this guy up here is Les Snyder. He was part of the club, and he was up here taking care of the board. This guy here was talking on a mic there. That's Orville Lake. He was one of the more colorful people of the dog races. His coverage of them was interesting to listen to him, but he worked for one of the radio stations. In 1953, I believe this was, we started to build the community club building, and this was down where the current fire station in Soldotna is now, or in that area. And it was on land that Don and Verona Wilson donated to the community club. later was turned over to the city. But we started building this, and anyway, we built it. It was a 40 by 60 building. This is Chell Bear here. That's Gordon Taylor. Penn Buchanan back here. And Betty Ames here. And Joyce Carver and Maxine Rieger and Pauline Taylor were also there bringing food over for lunch that day. And I don't know which one of these is which, but anyway, I get recognized Gordon Taylor, Betty Ames, and Chell Bear and Penn. Oh, and the guy kneeling here eating is Bud Johnson. And after it was built, we had dances in it, and this was one of the dances. And can anyone identify that couple there?
Is that Lefty and Ann Miller?
Pardon? I'm quite sure that's the Crandalls.
Oh,
Her name
yeah.
was Eileen, and
Yeah.
what was his name? I forgot. But I'm quite sure it's the Crandall. I had somebody else look at it too, and they said the same thing.
Yeah.
That's the Crandalls anyway. But we had dances in there on a regular basis. And I don't know the date. I have it written on this picture, but it was turned over to the city, and they tore it down. They salvaged the lumber out of it and everything and all that, but they had taken the roof down, and I have other pictures of it when it's in, there's nothing left of it. But anyway, and I cannot remember the date offhand. Like I say, I don't remember that, something that recent. In 1963, I had a helicopter take me around and take a lot of pictures. I took 3 rolls of 36 exposure Kodachrome, and I got a few of them on here. And anyway, this is the Sports Center. This is what it looked like in 1983. And I don't recall when it actually opened, when it started or anything, but this is what it looked like in 1983. And here we have the K Beach Elementary School, just started to build, and this is on East Poppy Lane. This is the Peninsula Center Mall in 1983. Safeway was open, McDonald's was open, and whatever was in the mall here was open, but the section in between had not been built yet. That's the Sizzler in 1983. Now the Caribou Family Restaurant. But that's the Sizzler. Here we have a newer picture of the mall. This is probably around, it's kind of a poor picture, the angle it was taken, probably around 2006 or 7 or something like that, which shows the Aspen Hotel there. And this one, I'm not sure what the date of that one is. But anyway, that's looking at Soldotna from the north to the south at the bridge down here. This is 2006, and the current bridge is still under construction, and they were using the bypass that they built. And anyway, it seemed like that was a year in building, if I'm not mistaken, because I have pictures of it earlier and later, and but this was in December of 2006. This is a little bit out of the way of Soldotna, but this is Ski Lac Lake, Ski Lac Glacier, taken from the top of the glacier. This was in 2005 when I took this. But when I came here in 1948, that red line there was the toe of the glacier. And over here, you can just see the little bit of hidden lake. But you could see the toe of the glacier, or whatever they call the bottom of the glacier. I'm certainly not much about glaciers or geology, but anyway, you could see that from the road.
Wow.
And you couldn't see much of it, but you could see it. And I drew the lead line across there as pretty much accurate. So in all this amount of time, this glacier has receded this far. this lake did not exist, of course, until the glacier receded that far. And I presume, since I've taken this picture in 2005, that it has undoubtedly receded further. And when this ice melts, all these glaciers are melting, it means that it doesn't retain the cold like it used to. And if you remember the old ice boxes, when your ice got down to very low, it got warmer and warmer in there, and finally you didn't have any ice left in it. And that's basically what's happening in Alaska. Of course, we've got a lot of glaciers left, but anyway, this shows what can happen, what has happened, and what is happening. And Ben's Hardware, that building there was at one time the post office, and it was built next to the bear den. And when Maxine Lee, who was our first postmistress here, when she left, Mickey Fay took over the postmistress job. And they had built the bear den. It wasn't called the bear den, they had another name for it. And for a while she had the post office in the bear den. And there were people who didn't particularly care to go get their mail in a bar. And so Joe built this building next to it, and they used that as a post office. And anyway, eventually Penn bought it, and he skidded it up the runway, up the airstrip, and I sold him this land here, and he skidded it up there and set his hardware up and ran it and built a new building, and he eventually sold it to Trustworthy. It was Trustworthy now. He sold it to Ellington first, but anyway, and then in 1984, I was visiting my sister in Sydney, Australia, and I walking down the street, and there's Penn's Hardware. And it's obviously, it's got Penn's Hardware all over the place. And I was surprised, took a picture of it, of course, and sadly, I was going to show that to Penn, but he passed away before I had a chance to do it. But he was quite proud of his paints, and when he started the building, he started his business, he researched paints. And I know I talked with him about what he was going to sell and everything, and I think he had Glidden, I'm not sure, but he was proud of his paint brands. And this Taubman's paints, apparently they're proud of it too, because they're advertised all over here. So I had to think of Penn when I took the picture. And that's another picture of Maggie the Moose. And anyway, now, that's all I put in for this. If we I don't know what time it is now, but
1:30.
1:30, okay. Well, we've got time to show other things, okay? I'll just run these through all. I've showed some of these before, and I have lots of other pictures on here. You know what? I have literally thousands of pictures, and trying to pick out something to show to make an interesting story, it's not that easy. And the older I get, the harder it seems to be to concentrate on it. And so I did put these extra pictures in here, and I'll run those through, and then I got other pictures like, okay, here we go. That is a building that was in Kenai, right off of the bluff, just down below Kenai Commercial Company. And I took this picture in 1949. There were two buildings there. And what was interesting is you see the fish drying on the rack. It's something you don't see anymore. And when I flew around with the interior with BLM, every village we'd go to in the summertime and the fall, there would be fish hanging on the racks, always. It was a sight you always saw. I have no idea if you still do that or not, because I haven't flown around the territory for years. But anyway, I missed there. I should have clicked all of them, and I didn't. It's my fault. But anyway, that I thought it was interesting that the I've had too many birthdays to do this. Yeah, there's that picture. And now this was taken in 1949, and was the Thanksgiving weekend. and I was working for the road commission, and Dale Rorson and he was going to go to Palmer where his folks live for the Thanksgiving weekend, and I was just going to Anchorage. I had my brother living in Anchorage at the time, I believe. But anyway, I was going to Anchorage for the weekend, and we flew with Dave Kellogg and PNA. They had a twin Cessna, and Dale and I were the only passengers, and so I sat in the co-pilot seat. And Dave was an interesting pilot. He had been a B-29 pilot in World War II in the Pacific, and he was always telling wartime tales, you know, and it was interesting to fly with him. But this guy in the Champ here was a friend of his, and they agreed to fly formation back to Anchorage. And so we took off and we flew formation, and I took a picture of it. This is how close we were. I had a little Bose B2 camera. It was not a telephoto lens at all. We were actually this close to it. And we flew till we get up to point position, and Dave said, well, this is too slow, and he dumped down. We went on in and landed. But in those days, they did things like that. And Sig Krogstad was the pilot for Gullwing Stinson for Alaska Airlines. And PNA's agent was Louis Neeson, and Alaska's agent was Phil Wilson. And anyway, flying with either one of them, and I know that they all go down to Homer and back, and they stop along the way at different places. But if they were flying over on the beach, and the tide was out, and the passengers didn't object, they'd stop to one of their set netters that one of the pilots knew, and they'd sit there and visit and have a cup of coffee and then take off again. These things were common in those days. Today, scheduled airlines don't do that anymore. And this is a C-124 Globemaster, and some of you have already heard this, but anyway, we had a fire. Tanana was threatening the Native Service Hospital in Tanana, as well as the whole village. So we had this C-124 flew in a D-7 Cat with a blade to control the fire. And I wasn't there when they landed, and I happened to be going by Tanana when they were loading up and taking off, so I stopped. These pictures are not in sequence like they should be, but anyway, I stopped and took some pictures of it. But that's got a D-7 on board, and the runway at Tanana wasn't all that long, and it was all a gravel runway, but it took every bit to get that off, but they got off. This was a fire we had to the east of the Yukon River, looking towards Canada, and we had quite a bit of problem there. I forget all the details, but the fire boss on the fire lost his tent and all his belongings and almost lost his life, and the whole crew was in danger. And I don't know if I might explain that when I flew for BLM, my job was to, first of all, if there was nothing going on, I'd sit in the ranger station until in Fairbanks or wherever, until a fire was reported by high-flying military aircraft or airlines. And the airlines were just starting the polar flights, so we got calls. They'd call into the CAA and give the coordinates of the fire, and then I would go out and fly the fire and determine how big it was, which way the wind was blowing, what the fuel was, and all of this, and call it back to the ranger station, and then they would get ready to go out and get on the fire. So that was my job. And then when the fire was burning, somebody had to fly over the fire at least once a day and be in contact with the fire boss to make sure that everything was going okay and tell him where the hot spots were and various things like that. But this fire here was a bad one, and like I say, we almost lost the fire boss on it. And anyway, it was they finally got it under control. But I have lots of fire pictures, and this was I landed on the Sheenjack River on a sandbar, and there was a small fire across the river. This is just north of Fort Yukon, and I had two firefighters with me, and they actually had a gasoline pump to put the fire, a pump to pump water, as well as their tools. And I dropped them off, and they went across the river, and I came back later on, and I checked on them every day and then picked them up. But we did that several times. Again, this is back to loading that D7 into that C-124. And actually, they had a D8. They were going to bring a D8 down, it's a little bit bigger, but it was a few inches too wide to fit, so they had to put a D7 in there, which is a little bit smaller. And all this came from Elmendorf. And that's my friend Nick Andriowski from Sleep Mute on the Kuskokwim River, and that's his fish wheel. And I told you the story about him to those of you who were here early, but Nick was a good friend of mine. Every time I'd land there, he'd always come out and meet the airplane, and I'd give him my empty gas cans. The other pilots would charge him 25 cents a piece, but he used the empty gas cans. He had them lined around his house and patched on the roof and various other things. But his name was Nick, but everybody called him Fogey. And the reason he got the name Fogey is he was in the trading post one day, and he was kind of grouchy and mumbling about something, and Nick Melich, who was a trader, said, "Oh, you're just an old fogey." And somehow or other, he liked that name and insisted on being called Fogey, and he was called Fogey to his dying day. And he, a number of years later, well, not too many years later, he was putting his boat in the Kuskokwim River, and it somehow got away from him, and he drowned. And we had a big fire at Big Delta. This is the Army base at Fort Greeley. That's an Army L-19 sitting there on the runway. And this threatened the whole base, and it was pretty bad, and it was a strong wind. And I stayed, I think I was about 3 days staying there. We had a ranger station just real close by there, so I'd slept there when I got a chance to sleep. But the wind was so strong that when it reached 42 miles an hour, the Army pilots were all grounded. Now, the Army pilots were flying the Army brass over the fire, and I was flying our people. And when the wind reached 42 miles an hour, they grounded the pilots. So I had to fly the Army brass as well as our own people. For about 2 days there, the wind didn't die down. And it was so strong that they had, I think there was, I don't know, 3 runways at least there, and none of them would fit the wind, so I took off diagonally from the taxi strip, and to back in the corner diagonally, I'd have to go over close to it, line up, and then release the brakes, and let the wind blow me back into the corner as far as it would go, so I'd have enough room to get off. And it was kind of interesting, but anyway, it was kind of a hectic 3 or 4 days there, because it made the national news. We had a CBS reporter there covering it, and it was threatening the base considerably. Yes?
Just curious, in your travel up in that country, you ever come across a pilot called Lou Maz? When we ran into him, he flew out of Galena. He's the one that told us about there's no old Bush pilots.
Lou not Maz?
Maz, M-A-A-S.
No, I don't.
He died a few years ago.
No, I don't. I don't recall him, no.
Yeah.
No, I sure don't, no. But anyway, that was a kind of a threatening thing. Well, there we are loading that up again. We've seen that before. This was the airplane, that's the airplane I first came to Kenai on, and that was a Gullwing Stinson. Sig Krogstad was the pilot. That's not him there, that's Louis Hendricks, who was a road commissioned engineer. And Sig was down that day, and he was walking around town, and we stopped visiting with him, then went over and took a picture of his airplane. But Phil Wilson was the agent for Alaska Airlines, and Sig was the pilot. And Sig died a number of years ago in Nome, and he was a well-known pilot in the old days. I believe that same airplane is in the Aviation Museum in Anchorage right now. Yeah. That's me in my PA-12 on Skilac Lake in 1954, I believe. I actually used that for my charter air service for a couple of years. And this is the one like I said earlier, I'd just gotten my rating and land and sea rating in the Grumman Goose, and we were flying all around that part of Alaska, and we landed at Ekwok on the Nushagak River, and a school teacher brought all the kids down to see us, which was typical in the villages in those days. And there I landed at Lake Clark, and this guy here is John McCormick, who was the chief pilot for BLM, and this is Marion Mooter. And Marion Mooter was an old timer that lived at Tenillion Point years ago in there. When I was living in McGrath, working for BLM, my cabin was right on the river. And every morning, I don't remember what time, but before I got up, this Norseman with, I think it was 660 horsepower, I can't remember what it had. And when your cabin is up on the bank and the noise comes from down below, it's magnified, and there's no way you're not going to wake up when that guy took off every morning. So it was my 660 horsepower alarm clock. When I got my commercial license, I went to Florida. I started flying in Anchorage at United Airmotive in fall of '51. And when it got cold, I wasn't getting much time in the short days and everything. So I decided to go to Florida and find a school down there, and I did. And this is one of the airplanes that I flew to get my commercial license. It was a PT-23. It's a World War II primary trainer. And anyway, it was kind of a fun airplane to fly. And then, okay, I showed the picture earlier of the two guys walking across the Sheenjack River. Here's where I landed with, in 1954, the BLM got a brand new Cessna 180, and I got to fly it. And these are the two guys I dropped off on the Sheenjack to wade across the river and put the fire out. Putting up fish. This is some of Fogy Andrianovsky's fish that he caught in the fish wheel, and they're putting it up. And it was always interesting to watch them, the women with their ulus. And actually, I believe, and somebody might correct me, but I believe that ulu means woman's knife in some native language. I'm not sure whether yeah, Carol's nodding her head, yes. But they were artists with that thing. I mean, you know, it's interesting to go to Homer and watch those guys fillet a halibut that just came off on charter boats. But this woman to put them to shame with an ulu. She'd have that salmon all filleted out in no time at all. This is the top of the Tustamina Glacier. And not a particularly historic picture or anything, but not many people get to see the top of the glacier from this angle. So I don't know, I took that in 2006, I guess. But anyway, that's what the glacier looks like on top. And if you haven't flown over the Harding ice field, it's an interesting experience to fly over the Harding ice field and see all of that vast amount of ice. Now, that's all I got in that, but I've got many, many more pictures. If anybody wants to see any more.
I do.
Pardon?
I said, I do.
Okay, well, let's just go over here and see what